238 miles directly to the south of San Antonio. As midnight struck, total war began as over 300,000 PLA troops in one of several enormous invasion prongs smashed their way across the border as coalition air support, as the largest air ever anywhere, joined them, such as of a squadron of Su-25s featured in this image, firing their laser-guided or beam-riding KH-23 air-to-ground missiles, as well as also firing their nose cannons at ground targets such as technicals and personnel. They also could carry other air-to-ground payloads that were sufficient for causing enormous destruction on enemy forces. As loitering munitions scoured the skies for targets on AI target-seeking modes, such as these CH-901As, no one was safe anywhere, as these invasion forces could strike in depth with everything from long-range artillery to their air power to missile strikes, and of course, in the closer-in mode with loitering munitions. As these personnel were finding out the hard way, they were being cut down with heavy machine gun fire as these armored phalanxes moved and worked together as a team in tactical formations, including in battalion-sized formations, which could surround a large area, and these forces could break off and simply run roughshod over any enemy forces encountered. As the vehicles worked as teams, and there were no adequate anti-tank weapons with which to deal with these forces, not to mention their loitering munition support, their total ISR dominance with their quadcopter vehicle crew and squad level assets, as well as also their high altitude drones, as well as also their air support and missile support and artillery support. The devastation was simply monumental. And the Americans were left in the dark and were confused, and many were scared as blasts began to occur all around them and they didn't know what to do. Although some would become reactionary and would pay the ultimate price for it, as in reacting to the invaders and not thinking about it and not doing more intelligent things, such as trying to get away from the hot zone so they could get organized and actually be effective, because being effective is more important than reacting in the moment. That is what will get you killed. If you wanted to be effective, you would find a safe zone and you would begin to delegate, as any good leader would, as these forces were reacting and were being simply wiped out for it, as they were in a primitive environment with a comms down situation, no ISR capabilities to speak of, and were completely being overrun by an enormous force smashing its way into the country. Speaking of the fighting going on in the lower Rio Grande / McAllen area, again, 238 miles to the south of San Antonio. 156 miles to the southwest, another battle was raging, and that was the battle that was occurring in Laredo. As the scenes like this were commonplace all throughout the nation, as the coalition forces, such as even the Trojan shock forces, as these scenes were not just scenes in the border areas like El Paso and Laredo, but all over American cities, these scenes developed with everything becoming rubble piles, highways being hotly contested, airstrikes and artillery strikes a constant, loitering munition strikes, cruise missile strikes, even tactical ballistic missile strikes, and total surveillance apparatus to watch everything in real time on the battlefield and send it back in real time to the squad level NCOs and also the vehicle-based combat data links, as these combat data links carried in the PDA form by the squad level personnel leadership or in the vehicles essentially mapped out in real time where enemy forces were and where friendly forces were, as their combat data links also acted as a beacon for their positioning, as even a squad would know where its rough position was based on where its sergeant was. As many civilians caught up in the action would do the wise thing and get out of the way, many would not and would be annihilated because many did not have a survival instinct. And this would be totally devastating for their situation. As many tried to fight back, they were not organized, they were not coherent, they had no logistical system in many cases, and were totally outgunned and outnumbered as massive forces flooded into specific areas and outnumbered the defending forces as a result. As the Chinese armored fist smashing its way into the nation was just one armored fist, as the Trojans were another, as there were many Chinese Trojan forces, whether paramilitary, which were all combat grade and combat trained and armed, or regular military PLA forces. Many areas were already in the process of being overrun, simply decimated, as these forces ran roughshod over the defenders. Within the San Antonio battle space, the coalition forces very early on were already on the move everywhere, clearing flanks as well as going for main objectives. That was the primary goal, was to effectively smash multiple key strategic areas at one time, as well as secure the main highway, I-35. That was an absolute must. This was a major node and it needed to be controlled, and it was filled with multiple military installations that all had to be subdued rapidly, not even giving them a chance to react. As the VVS Mi-35 Helo Wing, which was a combo of a transport helo as well as also a gunship, as this could transport a squad at a time. There were 32 of these helos that would be divvied up right away into 16 each for 2 different battles, as these Mi-35Ms were armed with S-8 rockets, 80 total, 40 per each pod on each side of the helo, as these pods are being fired. They were also armed with 8 Ataka missiles, which were ATGMs, as well as also could be armed with 8 Storm missiles as well. These attack helo gunships would transport the Spetsnaz forces into action, as they would conduct air assault operations right off the proverbial muscle, as it's called. As these Spetsnaz companies, there would be 3 companies utilized in the Camp Bullis military reservation battle, as 2 would be dropped off in shuttle flights, flying to their CCP property, picking them up, and flying them out and dropping them off. And a 3rd company would remain aboard the helos for use elsewhere in the Camp Bullis military reservation, while the attack helo gunships would provide total air support to their special operators on the ground of the 70th Special Purposes Detachment, essentially a Spetsnaz battalion. As these forces were not part of the 2nd Combined Arms Army, they were attached to them and were under their command for the time of this battle, including the VVS attack helo gunship / transport helos, the Mi-35Ms. Very advanced and capable versions of the original Mi-24 Hind. These helicopters were excellent for this mission, as the forces would be also in the same manner taken to the eastern edge of the Lackland military base, the air base. They would be dropped off on the eastern edge of the base, 2 companies at a time, with a third company to actually conduct the major air assault operations to capture high-value individuals such as the command staff of the 16th Air Force and the base commander, as well as also the capture and holding of the airfield itself, which was to be utilized later as a mega FOB. There would be multiple mega FOBs, as San Antonio was an even larger city than Austin, and Austin was a major city of over 1 million. As these forces were preparing to strike, the forces of the mechanized infantry belonging to the Russian 30th Motor Rifle Brigade would also be striking the installation. Both the Lackland Annex, as there would be 1 battalion devoted to that, as there were base security elements and other personnel in the annex, as well as also the main installation, as a full battalion would surround the installation on 3 sides, as the mechanized infantry forces and their vehicles would effectively conduct a C shape around the installation, with the special operators guarding the eastern escape routes, as they would cut off any escape. And there would be 2 companies of mechanized infantry sent into the installation to add additional support to the Spetsnaz forces that would conduct the air assault operations in the installation, the capture, and also the securing of the airfield operations. So these forces would both surround, cordon, and basically smash their way into the installation. As they would capture many prisoners, this was a training base. This is part of the Air Education and Training Command. They had basic training here. There were other flight training schools here. The 433rd Transport Wing was here with their C-5A Galaxies, as well as also there were the F-16 squadron of the 149th. And these forces would be annihilated by a combination of the Russian firepower, as Russian tactical ballistic missile strikes would come in, along with Chinese tactical ballistic missile strikes, mostly from the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade, firing some bunker-busting DF-15Cs, as well as also cruise missile strikes coming from the reinforced brigades of the 612th and 613th Strategic Missile Forces Brigades in Mexico, firing their subsonic but very long-range and destructive DH-10A cruise missiles, as they could fire a lot of these at a time, as they had called up reserve battalions to add to the active battalions that comprise the brigade ordinarily. So they could fire these mass-produced enormous quantity of cruise missiles at various targets at the same time, as they had a number of these, and they were firing them all throughout the South Central Invasion sector in support of the operations. As cruise missiles from the container-based systems, the Club Ks, which were the caliber cruise missiles of the Russians that were container disguised, as well as the Chinese equivalent, known as the YJ-18C, would add to the strikes at the strike of 2 a.m., as ample operations would still be going on by that time. As it took time for the movements to occur, including shuttling in quickly the different companies of the Spetsnaz involved, leaving 2 on the CCP property that would later be flown in with full gunship support to do a long-range reconnaissance patrol in the Government Canyon area to hunt down armed reactionary civilians who wisely fled there as soon as the fighting started. Heavy artillery strikes from the 385th Guards Artillery Brigade, including with their enormously powerful 800 battalion, would be firing heavy strikes into the Camp Bullis military reservation from their 122mm rocket battalions of their BM-21 Grad systems, as well as also, which they had 2 battalions of the Grad systems, as well as also the 152mm 2S-19 MSTA howitzer battalions that were also part of the 385th Guards Artillery Brigade, and there was 1 battalion of the 2S-19 MSTA howitzers of the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade as well. Early on in the fighting, however, armed reactionary civilian groups that emerged, as this is exactly what would happen in a situation such as this. There would be a lot of confused and panicked and armed people coming out when they could no longer use the internet, phone, and communicate and have total grid down and comms down situation. Many people were panicked and in a state of fear or confusion, and also many were armed and were trying to figure out and ascertain exactly what was going on with all the blasting and explosions. And as people were already traveling through the area, as this was a large city and even its outskirts there was common travel, people saw missiles being fired, which caused armed reactionary civilians to attempt to attack these Russian forces, who held their own on their CCP regime properties, but they even still called on reinforcements from their Venezuelan allies, who rolled in their BTR-80 APC and IFV versions of their mechanized infantry battalion, as well as also their AMX-13 light tank battalion, as these light tanks were still relevant and were a scourge to most vehicles and personnel. Although they were not very adept against main battle tanks, for a light tank they were definitely adequate against infantry fighting vehicles and anything less than that. As the Venezuelan forces were well armed for their task, they came into this area and annihilated armed reactionary civilians before moving on to clear other flanks, as large flank clearing missions were already underway, and these forces were holding their own with loitering munition support, ISR and AI directed, as well as their forces firing heavy machine guns like their DSHKs, as well as also their general purpose machine guns like their PKMs, as well as also light machine guns like their RPK-74s, as well as also the riflemen firing, and some having 25mm grenades beneath some of the rifles fired those as well, in addition to the loitering munitions, as well as also ATGMs being fired in some instances as well. As all these forces were working together and the Russians acted as dispatch forces, as they were the ones with the AI and the ISR capabilities, and they would simply radio to their allies, whether the Venezuelans or whether the Serbs, and tell them where to go. As the Serbs would work with also in the north of the armed reactionary civilians were already spotted clustering together by Russian ISR assets in this area, and as these armed civilians moved into the area, Serb mechanized infantry forces of one of their mechanized infantry battalions of their 1st Brigade moved into the area with heavy artillery support from their self-propelled Nora Bs, as the Nora B was the 152mm version of their self-propelled howitzer, as the Nora B-52 is the 155 version, but they were firing their Nora Bs, the 152 shells, in support of their mechanized infantry, warding off these armed reactionary civilians after wiping out a few hundred of them, as there were about 80 that escaped and ran right into the arms of the Serb armored battalion that moved into the area with their very powerful and modernized M84AS2 main battle tanks, which, similar to the Iranian Karar, had a remote-controlled heavy machine gun turret, as well as also a brand new fire control system, as well as also a ballistic computer and new optics and even better armor, as it was decked out full of the newest ERA plating that the Serbs could produce. As again, Serbia, despite being a small nation, was well versed in arms manufacturing when it came to ground vehicles like tanks, artillery, light armor. They had been using these for many decades and were well versed in this. They also could produce small arms. They were completely self-sufficient in ground vehicles, and as a result, they were well equipped, except for ancillary but highly important systems like AI and ISR capabilities. But nonetheless, these heavily equipped Serb forces, with Russian guidance, annihilated those that they fought against, as these Serb main battle tanks are firing 125mm shells, including one fired this direction behind this tank here, as they were destroying buildings that they were receiving fire from. This one was on fire back here. They rolled through the neighborhoods of San Antonio suburbia with impunity. They were unstoppable forces, as were the Serb mech infantry forces, who also ran roughshod over the armed reactionary civilian threat. As these Venezuelan forces were also quite capable, the Russian armor was also conducting flank clearance operations before it was to conduct its main operation with Russian combat engineers, also of the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade, as the Armored Battalion and the Combat Engineers, along with a Mechanized Infantry Battalion of the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade, were all, along with Spetsnaz companies, 3, again mentioned earlier, dropped off one at a time by 16 of these attack helo gunships / transport helos, the Mi-35Ms, to the eastern edge of the installation to cut off lines of retreat, and they would have full gunship support from 16 of these as they came in with their last company from bringing them from the CCP property, leaving 2 companies to conduct later patrols of the Government Canyon area, which would be devastating as artillery would be called in precisely guided by their ISR quadcopter assets. As now, these forces were all preparing to advance onto Camp Bullis Military Reservation. The Armored Battalion was clearing the flanks ahead of time, as was the Mechanized Infantry Battalion. The Combat Engineers would have gotten these personnel, but they all fled hurriedly into Government Canyon, and the installation was far more important. They could be dealt with later as they left the area. So all of these Russian assets, from these 4-post high-altitude reconnaissance drones to these serious attack drones, as there were several of them in this battle space which carried a decent payload. They were not as good as Chinese combat drones, but they were definitely effective weapons. There's another 4-post. There was also the armed high-altitude Chinese recon drone, the CH-4A, in this area, and another flying over this area where the Fort Sam military installation is, the Army base. As these installations were all highly important, they were all to be overcome immediately, as the mechanized infantry surrounded this area on 3 sides, with the Spetsnaz being shuttled in with 2 companies to guard the escapes to the east. 1 company would conduct the air assault operations, flying in to capture the airfield intact, as well as also the command elements of the 16th Air Force, as well as also the base command elements themselves as well, as these Spetsnaz forces were well armed for the task and would be dropped in conducting their air assault operations with heavy air support as Chinese aircraft from their JH-7s, a pair of which would drop all their munitions on the installation, as also there would be an F-16 airborne at the time of the attack as they were conducting a flight training operation when the grid and comms and ISR capabilities all went down with the tandem anti-satellite cyber strikes and EW systems being booted on, and a PL-12 air-to-air missile would be fired to annihilate this F-16. As the 433rd Transport Wing and the 149th Fighter would be destroyed mostly on the ground, as these areas of the installation are highlighted, as this is not the entire installation, but these are the key areas of it. This is the fencing that skirts the installation, as the fencing continues for a short distance and then around this way, as there's more of the installation slightly off this area, and the fencing here eventually connects with this. Heavy air strikes were conducted by these JH-7 aircraft that are leaving the area as they had dropped all their payload in this area. Heavy Russian artillery strikes are coming in from the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade's artillery battalion, firing into, from the 385th Guards Artillery Brigade, firing into the area using their 2 S-19 MSTA howitzer battalions. There's 1 battalion each firing into the annex of the base as well as the main installation itself. An entire battalion of these howitzers is 56 howitzers, so 112 howitzers were trained on the installation, both the annex and the main post. As the artillery strikes were enormously destructive, Chinese cruise missiles in the form of the DH-10As, which were subsonic but could still reach the area relatively quickly, were coming into the installation with Russian tactical ballistic missiles, such as their Iskander M's fired by their Iskander battalions, as they would fire a handful of these missiles into this installation, along with Chinese DF-15C bunker-busting missiles that would hit this hangar area, as well as a bunker that was under some of these buildings over here. And the cruise missiles would do follow-up strikes into the same area, as again, it was not uncommon for multiple systems to hit the same area. As Russian forces on this boulevard were both moving into the installation, smashing through the fencing, as well as also surrounding it, 2 companies would go to the north and surround it, with the other 2 moving to the south to surround it, with 2 additional companies moving into the installation to support the attack against it. As the Russians, their 3rd and final company, arrived in their attack helo gunships, the gunships began to fire their nose cannons, their 23mm cannon, autocannons, in support of the ground forces who tactically, in their rolling T's, wedge formations, double column formations, were moving through the installation. As these forces ran through the area, they were simply cut down by a combination of loitering munitions and fire coming from these forces, as by now they had made it here, and they were being fired at and cut down. Many of these forces were unarmed, and some were even trainees, as this was a basic training facility, as well as a training facility for flight training and other types of training. This was also the American Cyber Warfare Air Base of the 67th Cyber Wing, which was under the 16th Air Force, whose headquarters was also in this installation. As many of these buildings may look familiar to those who have seen maps of the installation, this area was hit heavily by artillery and airstrikes in this area here by the pair of JH-7s. And now with there was a highway just to the north of this boulevard known as Highway 90. These Russian forces moving into the area are deploying their platoons out of their vehicles, as this is a whole company here moving around. And these 2 squads overrun the guard shack in this entrance right here. There is a squad moving through the breach in the fence. There's a double column rolling shield behind this platoon of vehicles moving through the area. Another one behind these vehicles. These forces are providing mutual support to their armored vehicles as they are smashing through and into the installation. These forces are being guided every step of the way by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, which is connected to the ISR total surveillance grid of the Russian forces, as well as also the Chinese, of course. And their loitering munitions are on AI target-seeking mode. They're Lancet 3s. These forces, moving tactically, like in this wedge formation, are very powerful forces coming in with ATGMs, RPGs of different types, like the RPG-29 Vampire system. Even RPG-7s are still being used because they're very compact and light for the Spetsnaz forces to carry. They're lightweight and they're compact. The Spetsnaz still favored these weapons, as did the Chinese, because they were very effective, so the Chinese continued to produce their already unquantifiably produced Type 69 RPG, and the Russians still have ample stocks of RPG-7s as well. As these forces were smashing down the flimsy chain-link fencing with their vehicles, as this soldier's waiting to set up his Cornet ATGM right after this MTLB smashes through the fence there, the security forces were taken completely off guard and were outright annihilated by the sheer volume of firepower being employed against them. It's a 25mm grenade fired from the tube. These assault forces of mechanized infantry were already heavy enough, but then adding to that, along with the air power, were the special operations forces of the Spetsnaz forces operating in this area. They were well equipped for their task, and they even had FPV drone operators, which would fly the destructive small drones, the FPV drones, which carried a very potent explosive charge, which could devastate vehicles as well as enemy personnel. These forces would be devastating in battle, along with the attack helo gunships of the VVS, which would be firing their massive payloads at the ground forces, such as these rockets being fired, as well as the ATGMs, the Atakas, as these forces were now overtaking the installation with tactical ballistic missiles and cruise missile strikes coming in. These areas have already been hit by tactical ballistic missiles, hence the craters and destruction. These forces were destroyed by the missile strikes in this area. The artillery came in heavy as well, and even the 2S-12A mortars, which were used by the mortar company or fire support company of the mechanized infantry battalion attacking this installation. These were 120 millimeter mortars. They were fired from a standard base plate, which was a large base plate. They had wheels so they could be towed behind a GAZ-66 truck, and they were very powerful. The Chinese had their self-propelled 120 millimeter assault gun / mortar system. It was a dual-purpose weapon, but the Russians had their towed mortar system within their mechanized infantry battalion, and it was firing mortar strikes into the area, annihilating personnel as they moved through the area, along with loitering munition strikes. This was a total shock and awe attack. Artillery had already leveled these buildings. Personnel were fleeing out and into this area. Guard forces were moving up into the area after the shelling and rock and missiling had already occurred. The airstrikes had annihilated this entire area right here, along with also the artillery strikes, which came in and were enormous. The Chinese bunker buster came in, annihilated the bunker, and made a massive crater, along with the follow-up cruise missile strikes that were coming into this area as well, and also a cruise missile follow-up into this missile strike, and these Russian tactical ballistic missiles were coming in to hit an area in this area. And the prisoners that were netted were enormous. Many of these forces did not have ammunition on them. Although the basic trainees had their rifles, they had not been issued ammunition. The base security forces were the only ones at the time that had the ability to resist this enormous assault. As two companies were moving south, two companies moved into the installation. This would be an entire company moving through this area right here. The 3 combat platoons, with the headquarters platoon staying further back and away from the combat. As the Spetsnaz forces in their last company moved into the area, including in this area, there's a pair of their helos here, a pair here, and a pair right there. These helos would, after firing in support of the ground forces, move in and drop off their squads in an air assault operation, as these would be 4 helos coming into this area, dropping off their Spetsnaz squads, who would take over this area and assault the building, as the mechanized infantry forces, including this squad here, had by then attacked these forces already and then moved to the corner before making a final move here and assaulting these forces that had fled from the missile strikes that were coming into the area. In this area, this rolling T cleared this building while this squad went around as per SOP, standard building clearance procedures. They had already cut these forces down as they're all surrounded in blue. This squad would clear this building, or what was left of it, while this squad would clear this building, then come out and go around this way, assault these forces here and here, before moving to the corner and moving there. The Spetsnaz would then clear this building and capture their high-value individual, clear this building, have forces outside. They would then be picked back up by their attack helo gunships, and then they would be transported out safely of the area with their prisoners. The mechanized infantry forces would take prisoners of their own, as they would overrun this installation with ease, as the Chinese fighter squadrons had a few pairs of fighters J-16s in this area and a pair of J-11s in this area, as again, they looked very similar. The J-16, though, was a different aircraft. It was newer and more advanced, but the J-11 was already extremely capable and already quite advanced itself, but the J-16 had a shorter airframe. And the J-11 would fire from a further away distance, as this smoke trail indicates, a PL-12 air-to-air missile at the opening of this map, knocking this F-16 out of the air. This one was airborne at the time. As these Spetsnaz forces moved in, they had already annihilated these emplacements. As mentioned earlier, the base commander was only now starting to get serious about fortifying the installation. They had set up one of the new TPY-4 radars for ISR capabilities, these reportable buildings that went with the radar system. They had set it up and established a sandbag emplacement around it, but it would be hit by a Russian tactical ballistic missile strike as an Iskander-M would hit this area and annihilate it, as these helos would move in then afterwards and land their forces by fast rope into this area after first firing rockets and missiles, Atakas, and annihilating these MRAPs, which were part of the base security elements, as were the forces manning the sandbags, and this was a squad that was doing roving patrols around the perimeter. They were all annihilated by the Spetsnaz forces that were outside of the wire, as well as the helos as they came in. They annihilated these forces with 23 millimeter nose cannon fire, autocannon fire. As they fired rockets, they did massive damage to these hangars, as well as destroying this C-5 Galaxy here, and also these vehicles. The tactical ballistic missile destroyed this, made a massive crater in this area. Then the helos, after firing their missiles and rockets at their targets, including some Atakas into this building and this building, they then landed their forces. One squad would get into a firefight with squads of security forces moving in from this area just to the south, as it had already been hit by artillery earlier, and now mortar strikes had come in along with more artillery fire, as these imminent strike markers indicate, and mortar strikes, as well as FPV drones being launched by the FPV drone operators. As mentioned earlier, some of these Spetsnaz troops operated the deadly FPV drones that the PLA, as well as also the Russian forces, sometimes utilized, as these destructive helo explosive drones flown over a target would decimate it, including powerful vehicles, including main battle tanks. As these carried devastating charges, they annihilated these forces along with the 120 millimeter mortar strikes and 152 millimeter artillery coming from the 2S-19 MSTA battalion, whose firepower had already decimated much of this installation. As part of one of two companies assaulting the installation had moved in through this area after these PLAAF airstrikes from the powerful JH-7s, and also moving through an area that had just been hit by artillery as well. They now moved up and effectively annihilated these forces in this area with artillery support, as well as the Chinese missiles coming in and decimating these forces. The forces that were around the perimeter here had basically been dismounted from their vehicles. Some guarded this berm where the highway was, while others went through this drainage area, bounding and covering tactically, while others stayed low, went through the drainage hole and popped up on the other side underneath the fencing, and fired at these panicked fleeing forces and cut them down, along with assistance from these helo gunships firing Ataka missiles at the MRAPs and personnel, as well as firing their nose cannon at the personnel and vehicles. This squad would bound and move into this area and cut these forces down, as the attack helos were again supporting all of this with their cannon fire, as these were devastating weapons. They could track multiple targets and decimate them with their very capable destructive 23 millimeter nose cannon, as well as their rocket fire and their Ataka anti-tank missile fires as well. As now, the loitering munitions were also hitting targets, along with mortar strikes from their heavy 120 millimeter mortars, these forces were being decimated. They had nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. High-value individuals were captured in these buildings. These were command buildings. They would be taken by Hilo out of this base. These forces moved through and into this area after this strike had occurred, and then they would move and seize this area. There were 2 Spetsnaz squads landed at the golf course. They fast roped out at the golf course after missile strikes annihilated these space security elements. This was the golf course. They dismounted at the golf course. One went and took position in the parking lot, the other by the fence. These vehicles were all annihilated by Russian fire as these 2 squads that bounded and covered tactically took their positions in this area after these forces were all wiped out, as this squad moved into the area, as well as the attack helos assisting with their nose cannons. As all these forces were simply decimated by all of the heavy firepower from the mechanized infantry assault forces, as well as also the very capable elite Spetsnaz forces with their very powerful Mi-35M attack helo gunships. As they fast roped into their areas, they quickly began to guard the outside while the other squads took the insides and eliminated or captured these personnel before clearing the rest of these buildings. These other forces had fled and were annihilated by artillery and loitering munition strikes along with these base personnel, base security forces. This squad was holding it down out here thoroughly with these FPV drones as well as small arms fire and RPG fire, as well as calling in artillery with their quadcopter assets, getting the exact coordinates where the AI system put together the strike packages for the precision artillery strikes of the 2S-19 MSTA howitzers. As all of that unfolded, these personnel were very thorough in their operations as they held the outside of these buildings while the other squads went in and cleared them. As they tactically did building clearance operations, the forces holding the outside would ostensibly fire on anybody that entered the area as they took very tactical positions where they could overwatch with intersecting fields of fire a large area. As these forces then proceeded to clear all the hangars, including these 2 squads, this squad taking the end right here, watching the outside while this squad went in and cleared it. These forces moving out were hit by artillery and decimated. As these mechanized infantry combat platoons moved in, they engaged some of these American forces, called in a mortar, decimated them with quadcopter asset. This force was destroyed, or this MRAP of the base security was annihilated by the Chinese missile strike, and there were also Russian missile strikes that destroyed these forces. This combat platoon dismounted all of its squads to clear these buildings, and they would take prisoners as well as annihilate these armed forces that were outside, these base security elements. The lead vehicle and these forces fired on them and destroyed them, as the very powerful BMP-3 would fire a shell, its coax, and even 30mm fire as the dismounted forces were conducting their building clearance operations, as well as their loitering munition support from their Lancet 3s operating in the area that were already finding targets of opportunity throughout this battle space, as the Spetsnaz had thoroughly captured the airfield after all these aircraft had been destroyed by the rocket fire, as well as the base security elements by missile and rocket fire, and the buildings were even damaged by missile and rocket fire in this area, but that could be accomplished so long as the airfield itself was not damaged, because this was going to be converted into a mega fob, one of several within San Antonio, because there were several suitable sites for mega fobs, and San Antonio was a large city and needed to be thoroughly occupied, and the garrison forces needed a place to basically set up their operations. Therefore, they needed megafobs, and this place would be a suitable megafob as it had a relatively long runway that went beyond this area and up into this area, and they could have rubble clearance operations and simply bring in modular building parts and make their own buildings or portable buildings or setting up tents and create their own fob out of this battered, destroyed installation. As some of the installation would be left intact, except for this area that was hit by multiple cruise and tactical ballistic missile strikes, as well as over here, the rest of the installation would be kept relatively intact and would be utilized as living areas for the garrison forces until they could create more suitable housing arrangements, like clearing all the rubble from the artillery and very powerful PLAAF airstrikes, and then essentially set up the modular buildings and portable buildings and tents, and therefore they would have more room for more troops. As these other forces were clearing buildings, going in and clearing and then taking positions to assist the Spetsnaz forces in their high-value capture operation, this platoon here, again, would move through this area after the missile strikes occurred, and these Spetsnaz troops that landed here would take position here and would end up outflanking these forces while mortars would come in along with loitering munitions and assist in finishing them off, including these forces that emerged here. They would mutually support these vehicles coming through the area, these Spetsnaz forces. These forces would all be cut down by the forces breaching the installation in multiple places, having fields of fire that would effectively go through different areas. As these squads penetrated the guard shacks, they would move into different positions, also assisting in engaging these forces, causing them to run and get cut down. Moving here would assist in the firefight that would break out over the guard shack with these security personnel before these squads would enter. And then they would move into position around here, while this squad would move and stay here. As these personnel moved into this area, they were basically cut down by the vehicle-based fires, as this lead BMP-3 would annihilate them with a 100mm shell, coax fire, and the follow-up MTLBs would fire their 12.7mm and these would also like T going here, this rolling T going building, and of course these squads taking their positions, mutually supporting one another for this building clearance, and then this squad assisting the Spetsnaz forces before taking a final position here and cutting these enemy forces down as they move through the area. The other Spetsnaz forces would hold down the golf course area with a field of fire that effectively covered this area. So with the other platoon from the other company moving up into this area to clear it first before then having all three platoons move down through this area as they would move through this area here. This platoon here, after clearing this area, would be the platoon right here on the end. These forces would then engage what was left of the base security elements and clear the last remaining buildings as the Spetsnaz forces cleared these buildings and basically assisted in the heavy mortar fire operations by using the copter to get the precise coordinates of these forces trying to flee, including 20 fleeing out of this hangar that would get annihilated by these strikes, including these personnel that were already outside getting hit, along with this vehicle which would survive. It was just sitting here, it was abandoned. But then these forces moving here would get annihilated by also loitering munition strikes, and Russian missile strike here destroyed these forces. Chinese missile strike destroyed this. Security on artillery strike here destroyed these forces fleeing out of the building, as well as also being fired at by the Spetsnaz forces firing at the lead elements. This was a very rapid battle, as there were other Spetsnaz forces beyond these wooded areas outside of the fence line, watching in the installation as well. They assisted in the suppression of these forces, along with the helos firing at them as well with their 23mm main gun early on, as they were bringing in the last company to do the actual air assault operations. As these last base security elements moved in their wedge formations and bounded and covered together against the Spetsnaz forces, this helo, which flew here, turned and fired Ataka missiles and his 23mm autocannon, as well as artillery ISR directed and mortar ISR directed, while these FPV drones, 3 of which were sent by the FPV drone operators of a Russian Spetsnaz squad, as they had been dropped into this area and took their position here as they bounded into these areas. This one to clear this building and this one to wait outside and watch this area tactically. They executed a flawless operation. There were only a few wounded in terms of the Spetsnaz forces when they were engaging all of these elements. There were a few wounded Spetsnaz forces. Most of them that did get hit took rounds in their body armor and were fine, other than cracked ribs. But the attack helo gunships, the artillery, the mortars, and the FPV drones were more than enough to annihilate these two full platoons of dismounted American-based security elements, along with loitering munition strikes on these vehicles. These were equipped with HE warheads, which were enough to destroy these MRAPs. Just crashing down on with an HE round would bust right through the roof of one of those and annihilate it. And as these other loitering munitions came in, they too took targets. This was a platoon of one of the companies of mechanized infantry in the C shape around the entire installation. As the installation again was taken in a flawless operation, the Spetsnaz forces performed outstandingly in this operation. The PLAAF immediately annihilated an airborne threat. Although the F-16 was training and was not armed, it was annihilated by a PL-12 air-to-air missile from this J-11 fighter, and the two JH-7s dropped all of their free-fall ordnance on a portion of the airbase, and it was totally flattened and completely pulverized into dust. As the Russian mechanized infantry forces also conducted their operations in a very precision-oriented manner. Everything they did was tactically astute and perfect. It couldn't have been done more perfect. It was done flawlessly, and it was done rapidly, as this installation fell within 1 hour of all the movements and everything. It only took 1 hour to overrun this installation. It was overrun in a single hour. These Russian forces performed outstandingly. They had all of their experience from the Great Eastern European Proxy War, and this installation had flimsy defenses. It was easy to infiltrate and basically run through, and that's exactly what happened. They took hundreds of prisoners in this battle as well. They were all classified as POWs. They would all be treated humanely and even given medical attention for those that had been essentially mortally wounded, or morbidly wounded, I should say, morbidly. They would receive immediate medical attention. They would even be airlifted out by some of the Russian attack helo gunships, and they would be flown back to the 91st Headquarters Brigade's medical battalion, who operated a surgical center that would work on friendly coalition forces just as much as they would American POWs, as that was part of the Geneva Conventions. It was essentially a must to give the enemy medical attention if they were a POW within your care. If they were a ward of your military forces, then you had to treat them humanely and give them medical attention, as well as also proper food and water and accommodations. And that was what the Russians did. The Russians were very tough, and they were very firm, and they were very brutal in combat, but they were not monsters in terms of how they treated prisoners. Neither was the Chinese PLA, nor some of the other paramilitary elements, but the PAP was a whole different story. The PAP were the true believers in the party, and they would do anything that Comrade Xi ordered them to do, including their new overlord, who was Wei Feng, who had sinister designs on the American people. It was like comparing the Wehrmacht to the SS. The Wehrmacht was nowhere near as brutal or nasty to civilians as the SS was. As the Russians would also be fending off American assaults from their reactionary civilian elements, the American military forces